The story that I'm going to read to you today is a long story, but it is worth listening to. It's about Abraham Lincoln. You know how I always ask you at the end of a story if it's real or make-believe? Well, I'm going to tell you before I start reading this to you that this is a true story. This actually happened. It was documented. And this is a book about that true story. So it's called Mr. Lincoln's Whiskers. Now, back in the day when Abraham Lincoln, or before he had become president, they called beard. Sometimes men have a beard, like hair right here on their chin, right? They call beard whiskers. So when they say Mr. Lincoln's whiskers, they mean his beard. Because he didn't always have that beard, right? Actually, he first started off without it. And it was this little girl's idea for him to actually grow a beard. And her name's Grace. Grace flew down the porch steps. "Papa, how was the fair?" she asked. "Did you meet Mr. Lincoln?" "No, Grace," Papa said. "Abraham Lincoln didn't come here to New York. He's remaining in Springfield, Illinois during the election." Grace's brothers and sisters greeted Papa just in time for supper, Mama said. Papa had presents for everyone. "Levant, Helen, Alice, these are for you. George, Stephen, Frank, and here's one for baby Una. And this, Grace, is for you." "A poster of Mr. Lincoln! Oh, Papa, thank you." She held it up. Mr. Lincoln's face stared back at her. He looks kind, Grace thought, though his face seemed sad. This is what he looks like. Her brother Levant snickered. "He looks like a rail splitter, not a president." "That's your opinion," Grace said. "Mr. Lincoln's got a good heart. I can see it in his face. He doesn't like slavery, does he, Papa?" "That's right," Papa said. George, Grace's oldest brother, spoke up. "But if Lincoln's elected, our country will be split in two." Her brother Stephen shook his head. "How's it fair for one man to own another?" "It isn't," Grace said. "People are mean to slaves. I know about it from a book. If I could, I'd vote for Mr. Lincoln." "It's a good thing girls can't vote," said Levant. Grace pushed back her chair and ran out. Now, all of this is true. So during this time, women weren't even allowed to vote. And there was slavery during this time. That means that people would own other people. They would actually buy other people and make them do their chores for them and stuff and treat them badly. And so if Abraham Lincoln, they knew if he became president, then he was going to say, "No more slavery, we can't do that anymore." And then that was going to cause a problem in the country, a civil war. Alone in her room, Grace studied the poster of Mr. Lincoln. "If I could, I'd vote for you," she whispered. Bright light from the moon cast deep shadows all about. The shadow fell across the poster. It made Mr. Lincoln look like he wore whiskers. Grace stared. With his chin and the hollows of his cheeks covered, his face seemed less sad. "What if," Grace thought. So you can kind of see this picture that she's holding of Abraham Lincoln. He doesn't have a beard yet, or whiskers, what they call it. But the shadow is casting it so it looks like he does. And then she thought, well, maybe that would be a good look for him because he wouldn't look so sad. But he's kind of got a really thin face, and she thought it would make it look better. She hurried over to her desk. She took a sheet of paper and dipped her feather quill pen into a pot of ink. By the light of the moon, she wrote. They don't have just like regular pens with ink coming out like we have now. She would have to take the end of a feather, dip it in ink, write a little bit, dip it in the ink again, write a little bit. So it's very hard to write a letter. "Dear Sir," so this is the letter she's writing to Abraham Lincoln. My father has just come from the fair and brought home your picture. I'm a little girl, only 7 years old, but want you to be president of the United States very much. So I hope you won't think it very bold to write to such a great man as you are. Have you any little girls about as large as I am? If so, give them my love and tell her to write me if you cannot answer this letter. I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway. And if you will let your whiskers grow, she's telling him to grow a beard, I will try to get the rest of them to vote for you. You would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, or beards. And they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. My father is going to vote for you, and if I was a man, I would vote for you too. But I will try and get everyone to vote for you that I can. I must not write any more. Answer this letter right off. Goodbye, Grace Bettel. So basically she's saying in her letter, I think you should grow whiskers. You would look good, and I'll try to get all my brothers to vote for you if you do it. Grace addressed the envelope, Springfield, Illinois. That's where Papa said he'd be. She put the letter in the envelope and tucked it under her pillow. Then she climbed into bed. In the morning, Grace hurried to mail the letter before going to school. She kept it hidden under her cape. If Levant knew she had written to Mr. Lincoln, he would laugh. Just before the post office on Main Street, Grace stopped. Should she send the letter? Wouldn't she seem foolish, a small girl writing to such a great man? No, she decided she had made a good suggestion. So she did. She thought of a pretty good idea, and she is going to send her letter. She went inside the post office. May I have a stamp, Mr. Man? She handed the postmaster a penny and her letter to Abraham Lincoln. Whoa, this is to Abraham Lincoln, he exclaimed. Why, Grace Bettel, did you write this yourself? She blushed and nodded. Well, he said, I wouldn't expect an answer. Mr. Lincoln's a busy man. Grace's shoulders drooped. She turned and walked slowly out of the post office. A few days later, she returned. Is there anything for me? No, said Mr. Man. I told you Mr. Lincoln was very busy. But the next day, she trudged back, and the day after that. So she's going back to check to see, did Abraham Lincoln write her back? On the 7th day after she sent her letter, Grace headed towards the post office. Light snowflakes were falling. A crowd stood in front of the building. They talked in excited whispers. A man pointed. Here's Grace, he said. Mr. Man rushed outside, waving an envelope. Your letter came from Mr. Lincoln. Imagine, at our post office in Westfield. Grace took the letter. Her heart beat fast as she opened the envelope. What did Mr. Lincoln write? A boy asked. He wrote her back. That's amazing. But Grace was already hurrying home, reading her letter. She burst into the parlor. Mr. Lincoln answered my letter. Mama looked up. You wrote to Mr. Lincoln? Her brothers and sisters gathered around. What did you say? Where did you send it? Papa put down his pipe. Read us what he wrote, Grace. That's pretty exciting. This is an actual letter. These exist. She held up the letter. Spots from the melted snow dotted the paper. Grace read aloud. Miss Grace Bettel, dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affection if I were to begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. He wrote her back. So he's telling her, hey, I don't have any daughters, but I do have 3 sons. And then he says to her, are you sure I should grow whiskers now that I'm running for president, they might think you're just doing this because you're running for president, right? Levant made a face. You wrote him about growing whiskers? I can't believe it, Mama said. Mr. Lincoln wrote to our Grace. You should be very proud, Papa said. On election day, Grace watched Papa and her brothers go off to cast their votes. Oh, I hope Mr. Lincoln wins, she thought. Late the following day, people were shouting in the streets. The telegraph says Mr. Lincoln is winning. He's going to be our next president. Grace and Papa hugged each other. A month later, Papa sat in the parlor reading his newspaper. He looked up. Listen to this, he said. Abraham Lincoln will be traveling from Springfield to Washington, D.C. to be sworn into office. His train will stop for wood and water right here in Westfield. Grace jumped out of her chair. Can we go to the station, she asked. I want to see Mr. Lincoln. After writing him such a foolish letter? Asked Levant. Her brother's so mean. The wind whistled across the tracks. Grace pushed her hands into her muff. She blew out a steam of air. There was a faint chug-chug. Grace squeezed forward. Mama touched her shoulder and pulled her back. Stay close. But I want to see Mr. Lincoln, Grace said. The chug-a-chug got louder and louder. A bell rang. Gray clouds rose from the engine's smokestack. People shouted and waved flags. The long, dark train drew into the station. Grace stood on her toes, but she couldn't see above the stovepipe hats and feather bonnets. Where was Mr. Lincoln? Was he speaking? She couldn't hear with all the clapping and cheering. She can't see him. She can't hear him. She's so little, Suddenly, people began to turn around. Where is she? Where is she? Grace heard them murmur. Grace, Grace! Mr. Mann pushed through the crowd. Mr. Lincoln wants to see you. Mr. Mann took her arm. Oh my goodness, he wants to see her. Everyone hurried to move out of her way. Grace could hear their whispering as she went past. Mr. Mann led her to the front of the platform. Oh, she gets to meet Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln stood before her. Hello, Grace, he said. How do you like the improvement you advised me to make? He actually did it. He grew a beard just because she had said that would be better. Mr. Lincoln bent down and gave her a kiss on the cheek. His whiskers tickled her cheek. Look, he actually did it. And these are, it says, on October 1860, Grace Biddle of Westfield, New York, wrote to Abraham Lincoln advising him to grow a beard. These are the reproductions of the letters they exchanged. So it's very hard to read because it's so old, but these are the actual letters that she wrote and that he wrote back to her. This is a true story. This actually did take place. All right, so when I say, is this story real or make-believe? This story's real. This really happened, okay? And the setting is really, most of it's happening in Westfield, where she lives, right? Sometimes the train station, sometimes her house, sometimes the post office. Kind of depends. The characters in the story are going to be, well, Grace, Abraham Lincoln, mother, father, probably her brothers in there too. Really, really good story. Mostly because it's true. Pretty awesome.